We are told this is a fairy tale, a story meant to teach children a lesson about broken promises, a strange man, a magic tune, a punishment that feels exaggerated enough to be unreal. But the story you've been given is not the story that survived. Most fairy tales were softened over time, violence trimmed away, meanings rounded off, endings made safe. This one wasn't. At the centre of the tale of the Pied Piper of Hamelin is a detail that never disappears, no matter how the story is told. Not the music, not the rats, not even the piper himself. The number, 130 children. Every version agrees on it. Every record preserves it. Every retelling circles back to the same date, June 26th, 1284. There is no single canon version of this story, but there is a fixed absence. The children do not return. That consistency matters. Stories change when they are entertainment. They do not change when they are carrying something too heavy to release. What survived in this tale is not magic. It is memory. A record of loss repeated so often it hardened into narrative. A warning passed forward because it could not be spoken plainly. This was never a children's story. It was a town remembering something it could not undo and could not forget. In medieval Europe, stories were not preserved by books. They were carried by voices. Most people could not read. Memory travelled through repetition, through gatherings, through generations that passed information by telling it aloud. This meant stories changed, details shifted, characters blurred, variants multiplied, but change did not mean invention. When folklore scholars study oral traditions, they look for what does not move. Across dozens of versions of the Pied Piper, the surface details fracture. The piper's nature changes. The explanation changes. The tone changes. But certain elements remain fixed. The year, the date, the number of children, and most importantly, the fact that they never return. Those details persist because they are not decoration. They are structure. Oral stories bend around trauma. They soften its edges, disguise its cause, and replace certainty with symbol. But they do not erase the loss itself. When a detail survives every retelling, it is not fantasy. It is the part of the story that could not be forgotten. And in Hamelin, that is where the record begins. In every version of the story, the event is anchored to a single day. The year is 1284. The date is June 26th. It falls on a Sunday, the feast of Saints John and Paul. That specificity is not ornamental. It fixes the loss to a moment the town would have shared. Sunday mattered. Church bells structured time. Adults gathered indoors for worship, bound by obligation and expectation. Children were left outside, moving freely through streets and fields, unobserved for hours at a time. The town was not absent. It was divided. What disappears on that morning is not an unknown number. It is exactly 130 children. Not many, not most. The count never changes. Among them is the mayor's own daughter, a detail preserved even when other elements blur. Authority did not shield the town's leadership from loss. The religious calendar adds weight. Feast days were moments of suspension, when routines shifted and vigilance softened. The structure of the day itself made disappearance possible there. A stranger arrives in Hamelin. He wears pied clothing, bright, multicolored garments that mark him as an outsider. He carries a pipe. The town is facing a crisis. A promise is made. If the stranger solves the problem, he will be paid. He accepts the agreement. He plays his tune. In some versions, only the rats hear it. In others, no one hears it at all, except those meant to follow. The stranger leads the rats away. What happens to them changes depending on the telling. They drown. They vanish into a mountain. They are never seen again. What does not change is what happens next. The town refuses to pay. The stranger leaves, but not without warning. He says he will return. Some say the next day. Others say a year and a day. When he comes back, it is Sunday morning. The adults are in church. The children are outside. He plays again. This time, only the children hear the music. They follow him, out of the town, toward the mountains, to a cave. They enter. The cave closes, or disappears. Not all children go inside. Some cannot hear the music, a deaf or mute child. Some cannot see the way, a blind child. One turns back to fetch a forgotten coat. One cannot move fast enough, a lame child. In some tellings, one is stopped by a babysitter. Those children return. The rest do not. Exactly 130 children are gone. The story ends there. Fairy tales change. Towns do not. When historians went looking for the origin of the Pied Piper, they did not begin with stories. They began with records. One of the earliest appears in the Lüneburg manuscript, written around 1450 by a monk. It is not a book of legends. It is a sober monastic record, written in a factual tone, meant to document events, not entertain. Within it is a simple entry, the taking of 130 children from Hamelin by a piper. No embellishment, no explanation. Then there are the town records of 1384. The very first line reads, "It has been 100 years since our children left." That wording matters. These records have been examined, tested, and authenticated. They withstand scientific scrutiny. They were not written as myth. Around the year 1500, an inscription was placed on the town hall. It states that in 1284, 130 children born in Hamelin were led away by a piper into a mountain. Not a story, an assertion. Inside a church once stood a stained glass window, installed around 1300. It showed a piper in vivid clothing, with children dressed in white behind him. Though the church was later destroyed, written descriptions survived. The image was faithfully reconstructed from those accounts. There is also a stone from the old town gate, now kept in the Hamelin Museum. It repeats the same loss. And finally, there is a street. Bungelosenstrasse, the street without drums. To this day, music is forbidden there, not by law, but by memory. Fairy tales forget. But Hamelin remembered, in stone, in glass, in ink, and in silence. The story gives us a villain, but medieval listeners would not have seen him that way. In the Middle Ages, pipers were distrusted. They were itinerant, moving from town to town, without guilds, without land, without protection. They were tolerated at festivals and turned away the rest of the year, associated with bad luck, with disorder, with ill omen. But the clothing matters more than the instrument. The piper is described as pied, bright, multicoloured, impossible to ignore. That pattern was not whimsical. It was worn by executioners, men whose role was not hidden, but displayed. Their work required visibility, spectacle, public recognition of death. Even today, the colours survive, not in fairy tales, but in uniforms like the Swiss Guard, a visual language from the same era, bright, formal, ceremonial, marking authority over life and order. Seen this way, the piper stops being a man. He becomes a signal, a role, a process, an event given a face so it could be remembered. The town did not need a monster. It needed an explanation. So it created a figure that could carry blame, carry fear, carry meaning. The piper was not a person who took the children. He was the shape the town gave to a loss it could not name any other way. When a story refuses to fade, explanations rush in to fill the silence. Over centuries, scholars have tried to explain what happened in Hamelin. Some theories feel intuitive, others feel desperate. The first is the plague theory. Later versions of the story are filled with rats, so it feels natural to assume disease. But the timeline does not cooperate. The Black Death does not reach Europe until nearly 70 years later. Rats do not appear in the earliest tellings at all. They enter the story only after the mid-1600s, and plague does not target children alone, on a single day, in a single town. This theory collapses under its own convenience. The second explanation is the Children's Crusade. In 1212, thousands of children did leave their homes, marching under religious fervour, many never returning. At first glance, the parallel is unsettling, but the dates are wrong. The Crusade occurs decades earlier, and sources written after 1250 describing it are widely considered unreliable. The theory explains movement, but not why Hamelin's children vanish in 1284, on a specific Sunday, on a fixed date. Then there is the dancing plague. In 1237, in Erfurt, a group of children began dancing uncontrollably. They collapsed. Some died. Others were left permanently damaged. One explanation is ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on rye, capable of inducing trance, compulsion, collapse. The behaviour matches parts of the Piper story. Children following music, movement without resistance. But no direct evidence links this phenomenon to Hamelin. It remains possible and unproven. Finally, there is the idea of natural disaster. The cave, the mountain, the sudden disappearance, a landslide, a collapse, an accident too horrific to face directly. In this reading, the piper becomes a shield, a way to move blame away from chance, from negligence, from unbearable guilt. None of these theories fully explain what happened. Each accounts for a fragment, but leaves the core untouched. Something happened in Hamelin, and the story exists because none of these explanations were enough to contain it. Among all explanations, one theory is taken more seriously than the rest, not because it is comforting, but because it fits the historical record. In the late 13th century, Eastern Germany was under strain. River-based trade, the lifeblood of towns like Hamelin, was declining. Commerce slowed, opportunity narrowed. At the same time, the law of primogeniture shaped family futures. The firstborn inherited everything: land, title, security. Younger children did not. They were expected to leave, to seek work, to settle new land, to disappear from the town that named them. This is where language matters. In medieval records, a child of Hamelin did not mean age, it meant origin. Anyone who left the town, boy or girl, young or grown, carried that label. Records from towns in Transylvania show something unusual. In the final years of the 1200s, families appear suddenly, bearing surnames tied directly to Hamelin. Archaeological finds in those regions reveal German cultural markers, tools, burial styles, settlement patterns, pointing to organized migration, not chaos. And the piper fits here too. Pipers were often freelance workers, hired to recruit settlers, to guide groups, to lead people toward new feudal holdings. Lords offered land, protection. incentives to populate empty territory. This theory explains how 130 people could leave together, but it does not explain something else. Migration accounts for movement, but not for silence, not for mourning carved in stone, not for streets where music was forbidden. It explains where they may have gone. It does not explain why Hamelin grieved as if its children had died. What remained in Hamelin were not answers. What remained were parents, mothers and fathers who woke up to empty rooms, silence where voices had been, routine broken beyond repair. And with loss came guilt, the kind that does not fade, because it asks questions with no safe answers. Why that day? Why that morning? Why were we not watching? Shame followed close behind. Shame is quieter than grief. It does not cry out, it turns inward. In a world shaped by faith, loss demanded meaning. Nothing could simply happen. Every tragedy required a reason, a judgment, a moral shape that made survival possible. This is where the story darkened. A villain was created, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. Because blaming a figure is easier than facing chance or negligence or unbearable responsibility. This was never entertainment, not a bedtime story, not a lesson about keeping promises. It was not written to teach children. It was created because adults could not speak. Hamelin did not tell this story to explain the world. It told it to survive. Because there are sentences a community cannot say out loud. Sentences like, "Our children left, and they never came back." So the truth was moved sideways, out of language, into symbol. The piper became a shape that could carry blame. The cave became a place where answers could disappear. Music became something dangerous, because it reminded them of movement and following and loss. And now that you've heard the story this way, which part stayed with you the most? The number that never changes, the silence of the cave, or a town choosing memory over forgetting? If this shifted how you see fairy tales, leave your thoughts in the comments. For more stories where folklore isn't fantasy, but evidence, subscribe to Lore Unlocked and stay with us. Some stories don't want to be forgotten.